At 5:30 a.m. on August 27, 1883, a Dutch captain on the high seas saw the impossible. The sun rising on the wrong side. It wasn't the sun. It was an entire mountain turning into incandescent plasma. In 4 hours, the island of Krakatoa would cease to exist. It wouldn't collapse, it wouldn't sink. It would transform into pure energy, equivalent to 13,000 Hiroshima bombs detonating simultaneously. The barometer in Batavia, 160 kilometers away, exploded. People's eardrums in Java ruptured instantly. The shockwave shattered windows in Australia, and then there was silence for 3 seconds because the sound was traveling. When it arrived, it registered as 180 dBs at 100 kilometer. A pistol shot to your ear is 140, but before anyone could process what had happened, the first of 9 giant waves was already on its way, 40 meters high, the speed of an airplane. And you, even knowing exactly what a tsunami was, would die trying to do the only logical thing, run inland, because no one told you that volcanic tsunamis don't follow the rules. And this doomsday sound, this roar that no one survived to properly describe, happened in one of the richest and most important regions on the planet in 1883. Because Krakatoa wasn't just anywhere, it was in the heart of the most lucrative colonial empire in history. Java, 1883. 30 million Javanese producing a third of all the world's sugar, half of Europe's coffee, 90% of the quinine that cured malaria, all controlled by just 30,000 Dutchmen who lived like kings in marble palaces, while the natives starved to death working the plantations. The Sunda Strait, where Krakatoa slept, was the jugular of world trade. 500 ships passed through each month, each carrying fortunes in spices, tea, opium, and rubber. If the strait closed for a week, the European economy would collapse. And in the middle of this vital strait, 27 kilometers from Java and Sumatra, lay Krakatoa, a 9-kilometer-long island that the Dutch called a dead paradise. Dead because the volcano hadn't erupted in 200 years, so dead that it became a tourist attraction. On Sundays, Dutch families picnicked on the black sand beaches, climbed the rainforest-covered slopes, drank iced tea, and watched the sunset. Children played where, in a few months, a crater 300 meters deep would be buried below sea level. The island had 3 peaks, Rakata and Dana Perboevata, beautiful, covered in greenery, teeming with exotic birds. No one imagined they were merely the tips of a 13-kilometer-long magma chamber, like 3 fingers of a gigantic buried hand, ready to burst out of the earth. But you wouldn't be a rich tourist picnicking. You would be what 99% of people were, a plantation worker, a sailor, a fisherman, a merchant, and that meant living in a tropical hill. The temperature never dropped below 35 degrees Celsius. The humidity was so high that your clothes would rot on your body in 3 days. Mosquitoes the size of beetles, transmitting malaria, dengue, and yellow fever. Drinking water could only be boiled, but fuel was expensive. So you drank water from the canal where they dumped sewage and prayed. Cutting sugarcane under a 40-degree sun for 16 hours. Wage, 2 centavos a day. Food, moldy rice and rotten fish. Life expectancy on the plantations, 35 years. And with a life expectancy of 35 years working in this tropical hell, you still had to survive the warnings that Krakatoa began issuing 3 months before self-destruction. Warnings that seem obvious today, but in 1883 were completely ignored. May 20th, first explosion. A dull boom at 10 a.m. Heard 160 kilometers away in Batavia, present-day Jakarta. Windows shook, dishes fell from tables. The Dutch Governor-General asked which warship had fired the cannons. It wasn't a cannon, it was Krakatoa, waking up after 2 centuries. For 3 days, ash fell like black snow over West Java. Crops were covered, well water was contaminated, cattle were dying from eating poisoned grass. The official response, a curious but harmless phenomenon likely to end soon. It didn't. June, July, August. Weekly explosions, each stronger. Fishermen reported that the sea around Krakatoa was bubbling. The water was too hot to dip a hand in. Fish floated dead by the thousands, boiled alive. August 11th, Captain Holman of the German ship Elizabeth passed through the strait. His report was found later. A sea of milk, rocks floating like cork, an unbearable smell of sulfur. Ash so thick we couldn't see the ship alongside. But the colonial authorities had an explanation, normal volcanic activity for the region. On August 20th, a week before the apocalypse, the Anir lighthouse keeper reported, "We can hear Krakatoa roaring day and night. It sounds like 1,000 locomotives. The sea is full of pumice. It's impossible to navigate. The government's response: keep the lighthouse operating normally. August 26, Sunday. Less than 24 hours to go, Krakatoa exploded at 1 p.m. with such violence that it was heard in Australia. A column of ash rose 27 kilometers. Total darkness fell over the strait. And do you know what they did? They organized excursions to see the spectacle. The steamer Loudon took tourists closer. They wanted to photograph the erupting volcano. Of the 86 people on board, they only survived because the captain, frightened by 3-meter waves crashing against the hull, decided to turn back. At midnight, it was impossible to sleep. The noise was deafening. Houses shook constantly. Animals fled inland. All the dogs howled incessantly. Horses broke their chains. Bays trying to escape. Every living thing except humans knew death was coming. And every living thing except humans knew death was coming. But when the sun rose on August 27, 1883, humans finally understood. Too late, 5:30 a.m., first massive explosion. Mount Perbevitan simply ceased to exist. Where there had been a 300-meter peak, there was now a hole spewing magma. The ash column rose 25 kilometers in 6 minutes. In Ketimbang, 150 kilometers away, the sky turned pitch black. People lit lanterns thinking it was an eclipse. It wasn't. It was the beginning of 72 hours of absolute darkness. The first tsunami arrived within 40 minutes, 15 meters high. The town of Merke was the first to disappear. 3,000 people swept away in 90 seconds. The fourth-pointed lighthouse keeper saw the wave coming and ran to the top of the 40-meter lighthouse. The water washed over him. His body, it was never found. 6:44, second more violent explosion. Mount Dana exploded. The northern half of Krakatoa slid into the sea. Billions of tons of incandescent rock hitting the water created the second tsunami. 20 meters high, speed 300 km/h. Tuk Betong in Sumatra had 5,000 inhabitants at 6:30 in the morning. By 7 it was gone. Neither the city nor the people nor any trace that they had ever existed. The wave swept everything away 3 kilometers inland and returned carrying the debris to the sea. 8:20, third explosion. Krakatoa Peak split in half. Witnesses on distant ships described a curtain of fire rising to the clouds, the sea on fire. Impossible, but it happened. The magma was so great and so hot that it ignited the seawater itself. The third tsunami was different, 30 meters high. But it wasn't a wave. It was a solid wall of black water, mixed with ash, rocks, trees, houses, and bodies, moving at 500 km/h. The steamship Bear was anchored in Tok Betong, 80 meters long, 3,000 tons. The wave picked up the ship like a toy and carried it 3 kilometers inland, climbing a 60-meter mountain. When the ship was found weeks later, there were cow bodies trapped in the funnels. But all this was just warm-up, because at 10:02 something would happen that science would take decades to explain. At 10:02, science would take decades to explain what happened, because Krakatoa didn't explode. Krakatoa imploded, and then exploded in a chain reaction that created the loudest sound ever recorded in human history. The magma chamber, now empty after spewing 13 km/h of material, collapsed. The entire ocean plummeted into the hole, billions of tons of seawater hitting magma at 12 degrees C. The resulting steam explosion was equivalent to 200 megatons of TNT. The sound. Oh, the sound. 180 dB at 160 km away. Just to give you an idea, 150 dB will already make your internal organs shudder. Volcanic on Rodriguez Island, 4,800 kilometers away. The police chief reported the sound of cannon fire coming from the east. It wasn't cannons, it was crackling from across the Indian Ocean. The shockwave was recorded on barometers around the world. It circled the Earth 7 times 7. In London, 16,000 kilometers away. Instruments detected atmospheric pressure rising and falling for 15 days as the wave ricocheted around the planet. But the sound was just the announcement. The real killer was already on its way, the mega tsunami, 40 meters high in some spots. But height doesn't tell the whole story. It was the speed, 700 km/h in deep water. Anir and Merak ceased to exist. They weren't destroyed, they were erased. Where once there were cities with thousands of inhabitants, now there was only bare rock. The wave ripped away the very ground. Century-old trees were uprooted with 10-meter roots. Iron bridges were bent like paper. In Tiranguim, the wave hit a 40-meter hill and kept rising. At the top was a Dutch colonial house. The Bejerink family was having breakfast. Water rushed in through the second-story windows. Of the 5 family members, only the 3-year-old daughter survived. She was found hours later, clinging to a palm tree 2 kilometers away. The steamship Loudon, the one with the tourists, was 60 kilometers away when the wave passed. Captain Lindemann wrote, "A mountain of black water approaching. Impossible to maneuver. We closed the hatches and prayed. The ship rose. I thought we were going to capsize. At the top of the wave, I looked down and saw the seabed exposed. So we went down. They survived. But when they reached Anier to search for survivors, there was nothing to search for. The city, the port, the people, everything was gone, just black mud as far as the eye could see. And where there had been cities, now there was only black mud as far as the eye could see. But at least you could see for a few hours, because then the true darkness came. A darkness that would last 3 days and kill more people than the tsunami itself. At noon on August 27th, the sun disappeared. It wasn't covered by clouds, it was blotted out. 20 million tons of volcanic ash suspended in the atmosphere, so dense that in Batavia, 160 kilometers from Krakatoa, people couldn't see their own hands, stretched. For 72 hours, 300,000 kilometers of Indonesia lived in absolute darkness. A lamp lit 1 meter away illuminated nothing. It was as if the air had turned to black ink. People got lost 2 meters from their own homes. Families were separated and never found again. But the darkness was the least of their problems. The ash wasn't just ash. It was pulverized sulfuric acid, microscopic volcanic glass, and poisonous gases. Every breath was like inhaling shards of glass mixed with battery acid. In Ketimbang, it began to rain hot mud, not ash water. Thick, sticky mud, 80 degrees, 178 degrees. It burned the skin but immediately solidified, creating a suffocating crust. 1,000 people died, buried alive in mud falling from the sky. The air became unbreathable, sulfur dioxide turning into sulfuric acid in the lungs. People writhed blood. Skin blistered like chemical burns. Eyes swelled shut. Cattle fell dead in the fields. Birds fell from the sky. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees Celsius in 6 hours, from 40 degrees Celsius at noon to 25 degrees Celsius at midnight. People who had survived the tsunami, wet and injured, were now dying of hypothermia in the pitch black. But the worst part was the thirst. All the water was contaminated. Ash-filled wells turned to paste. Rivers turned to liquid concrete. The sea was full of acid and corpses. Drinking anything meant certain death by poisoning. In Lampong, Sumatra, 2,000 tsunami survivors gathered on a hill. 3 days later, when darkness finally began to clear, they were all dead, asphyxiated, poisoned, dehydrated. 2,000 bodies in prayer positions, covered in half a meter of ash like statues in Pompeii. When the sun finally reappeared on the 30th, the survivors discovered they were in an unrecognizable world. And when the sun reappeared on the 30th, the survivors discovered who were in an unrecognizable world. But this transformed world wasn't just a problem for Java and Sumatra. Krakatoa had changed the entire planet. New York, October 1883. People took to the streets to see the impossible. The sun setting green, then blue, then purple. It wasn't a collective illusion. It was billions of volcanic ash particles in the stratosphere decomposing sunlight. For an entire year, every sunset in the world would be psychedelic. But strange colors were the least of their problems. Global temperatures dropped 1.2 degrees C. It doesn't seem like much. It was enough to destroy crops worldwide. The winter of 1883-84 was the coldest in decades. Europe, January 1884. Snow in June, frost in August, wheat crops destroyed, potatoes rotting in the frozen ground. The price of bread tripled. Food riots in Paris, London, Berlin. 100,000 people died of starvation, indirectly because of one volcano on the other side of the world. North America was not spared. Snowstorms in September. Rivers froze in October. Midwestern farmers lost everything. Cattle froze to death in their pastures. Estimated 200 million in agricultural losses. In today's dollars, it would be $20 billion. But there were frightening scientific discoveries emerging. The energy released by Krakatoa was calculated to be 13,000 times the Hiroshima bomb. If all the nuclear energy in the world today were detonated simultaneously, it would still be less than Krakatoa. The atmospheric pressure waves circled the globe 7 times. 7 were detected by barometers during 15 days, bouncing between the poles. It was as if the entire Earth had been struck by a punch and continued to vibrate. The sound was heard 5,000 kilometers away. For perspective, it's like an explosion in Lisbon being heard clearly in Moscow. Sailors 60 kilometers away had permanently ruptured eardrums. 3,000 kilometers away, people found it was naval artillery, and then came the most terrifying discovery. Analyzing the records, scientists noticed a pattern. Krakatoa explodes violently every 200 to 300 years. The last one before 1883, 1680, 203 years before. This means that Krakatoa didn't have a random explosion. It follows a cycle, a geological death clock. And in 1927, just 44 years later, something began to emerge from the sea, exactly where Krakatoa had self-destructed. And in 1927, something began to emerge from the sea, exactly where Krakatoa had self-destructed. Local fishermen fled in terror because they knew what their grandparents had seen. The monster was returning. June 1927. Fishermen report boiling water in the middle of the Sunda Strait. December of the same year, a black island breaks the surface. Scientists name it Anak Krakatoa, son of Krakatoa in Indonesian. The name couldn't be more prophetic. The island grew 5 meters per year. 5 meters. It's like watching a building being built by nature. By 1930, it was already 150 meters tall. Vegetation began to appear. Birds returned, tourists began to visit. Again, no one learned anything. 950, Krakatoa erupts. Small experts say. 1980. A larger eruption, normal for a young volcano, they assure. 2007, constant eruptions, natural growth phase, they explain. December 22, 2018. Saturday, 9:03 p.m. Anaki Krakatau collapses. 280 million cubic meters of the island slide into the sea in 90 seconds. The resulting tsunami hits Java and Sumatra in less than half an hour. 437 deaths, 14,000 injured, 33,000 homeless. And you know what the hardest part was? Scary? There was no warning, zero. The warning systems completely failed, just like in 1883. The victims were at beach concerts, New Year's Eve dinners, luxury hotels. The tsunami arrived in the dark, with no prior earthquake to warn. Entire bands were swept off their stages. Families watching fireworks displays disappeared. But the real horror was what they discovered later. ANC Krakatoa lost 2/3 of its height in 2018, from 338 meters to 110 meters, but it hasn't stopped growing. It's rebuilding 13 kilometers a week every single day. Krakatoa is getting bigger, taller, more dangerous. Current measurements are terrifying. The magma chamber is filling at the same rate as in 1880. The chemical composition of the lava is identical. The growth pattern is the same. It's literally Krakatoa rebuilding itself to explode again. And now in 2025, ANC Krakatoa has already recovered half of its lost height. The tremors have increased 400% in the last 2 years. Sea temperatures have risen 3 degrees C around the island. All the signs that were ignored in 1883 are happening now. And all the signs that were ignored in 1883 are happening now. But do you think your modern technology would save you? Let me shatter that illusion of safety. Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System. Installed after the 2004 tsunami. Detection time, 15 minutes after the event. Time needed to evacuate the coastal area, 45 minutes. You have a 30-minute deficit. You're dead. Your smartphone is useless. The electromagnetic wave from a V6 eruption, like Krakatoa, would fry cell towers within a 300-kilometer radius. No signal, no internet, no GPS. You wouldn't even know where to run. Rescue helicopters. Volcanic ash is pulverized glass. It enters the turbines, melts at 1,000 degrees C, and turns to concrete. All flights within a 3,000-kilometer radius would be grounded, cancelled. Planes in the air would crash with stalled engines, cars to escape. Java's roads can only handle the evacuation of 2 million people in 24 hours. 40 million live in the danger zone. 38 million would die in the traffic jam. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, 10 million inhabitants, just 150 kilometers from Anak Krakatoa. Exactly the same distance as Batavia in 1883, but now with 50-story skyscrapers that would become giant dominoes. Anti-earthquake constructions. There are no 40-meter anti-tsunami constructions. The force of water, moving at 700 kilometers/h, is greater than any human structure can withstand. The Burj Khalifa would be torn down like a toothpick. Bunkers, you would be buried alive. Ships would be thrown kilometers inland. Nearby islands would be completely submerged. There is no safe place within a 200-kilometer radius of a V6 eruption. And here is the most terrifying fact. Population at direct risk in 1883. 1,036,000 dead. Mortality rate 3.6%. Population at risk today is 40 million. With the same mortality rate, 400,000 dead. But the current population density would make the rate much worse. Actual estimate, 3 to 5 million dead in the first 24 hours. The Strait of Malacca, the modern successor to the Sunda Strait. 40% of world trade passes through it, 1/3 of global oil. If it closes for a week, gasoline prices double worldwide. The global economy loses $1 trillion. You are currently using something that passed through the Strait of Malacca. Your cell phone, computer, clothes, maybe even your food. When Krakatoa explodes, and it will explode, your life changes instantly. And when Krakatoa explodes, your life changes instantly. But here's what should keep you up at night. Krakatoa is just one of 100 active volcanoes on the planet. And the worst ones aren't in Indonesia. Yellowstone, United States United. It's not a volcano. It's a super caldera 80 kilometers in diameter. When it explodes and it's 640,000 years late for its regular eruption, it will be 1,000 times more catastrophic. 1,000 times more catastrophic. The United States would cease to exist as a functioning nation. 3 million ash in New York, a 10-year volcanic winter. 1 billion deaths from global famine. Camp Flegrei, Italy beneath Naples. 3 million people literally living inside a volcanic caldera. It's rising 4 centimeters per year. 4,000 tremors in the last year. When it explodes, Europe will collapse. Rome covered in ash, Paris in darkness for months. Toba, Indonesia, 74,000 years ago, it nearly wiped out humanity. The global population fell to 10,000 people. 10,000. We were nearly extinct. And Toba is waking up. Tremors have increased 100% in the last decade. Mount Fuji, Japan, a national icon, a postcard, and a time bomb. It's 300 years late for its cyclical eruption. When it explodes, Tokyo, 35 million inhabitants and 100 kilometers away, will be covered in ash. The global economy loses 5 trillion in a week. Volcanic mathematics is relentless. Every 500 years there's a V7 eruption, 100 times worse than Krakatoa. The last one, 1815, was Mount Tambora. We're 210 years late. Every 10,000 years a V8. Civilization ends. The last one was 26,000 years ago. We're 16,000 years late. And here's what no one wants to admit. We can't predict. No, really. Mount St. Helens exploded with 2 months warning. Pinatubo 2 months. Vesuvius in 79 pics 1 day. Antake in Japan in 2014 0 warning. 63 dead in seconds. There are 20 volcanoes, V6 or greater, could explode at any moment. 20 Krakatoas waiting, each capable of killing millions, altering the global climate, causing world famine, collapsing economies. One of them will explode in the next decade. It's a statistical certainty. It could be Anak Krakatoa. It could be Vesuvius. It could be one we're not even monitoring because we only monitor 10% of active volcanoes. 90% of volcanoes erupt unattended. And while you watch these 15 minutes, the geological clock didn't stop. Krakatoa exploded in 1680. Then in 1883, 203 years apart. If the pattern continues, the next catastrophic explosion will be around 2080. But Krakatoa isn't following the schedule. It's accelerating. 2018 was a warning, 437 deaths to remind us that it's alive. Since then, it's grown 60 meters. 60 meters in 7 years. It took its father 200 years to accumulate enough energy to 1883, the sun may only need 50. Right now, 40 million people live within 200 kilometers of Krakatoa. Jakarta with 10 million, Bandung with 2 million, and all the provincial capitals of Sumatra and Java. When it explodes, don't forget to share this video now. Every person in the risk zone who doesn't know will die unexpectedly, like the 36,000 in 1883. Comment your location. I'll respond with real data on volcanic activity in your region. Not the government's reassuring version, the truth. Subscribe. In the next video, I'll analyze satellite images of Krakatoa from the last 72 hours that Indonesia doesn't want you to see. The lesson of 1883 is clear. Nature warns before it kills. Anna Krakatoa warned for 3 months. They ignored 36,000 dead. Anna Krakatoa has been warning for 3 years. Daily tremors, rising sea temperatures, deformation of the volcanic cone, tripling of sulfur dioxide emissions, all the signs that preceded 1883. In August 1883, tourists picnicked in Krakatoa. In August 2025, tourists dive into its waters. History doesn't repeat itself. It screams warnings we choose not to heed. You have been warned. What you do with this knowledge will determine whether you will be a statistic or a survivor. When Krakatoa's son decides to surpass his father, the clock is ticking, the magma is rising, and unlike 1883, this time there will be no excuse for ignorance, only the choice between action or death by surprise. Zoe.